Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It depends where are you located now. So thanks very much for having me here in this fantastic conference and in this amazing session with fantastic presentation. So thanks audience to be here online, and I'm very glad to talk about this paper entitled Identify High Frequency Shocks with a Bayesian Mixed Frequency Vector Autoregressive Approach. This paper is a joint work with my partner in crime, Fabio Parla, who is online too now. And since is economist of Central Bank of Ireland, an usual disclaimer is applied. So as you can recognize from the title of presentation, we are going to talk about a specific and a novel identification approach into Bayesian mixed frequency vector autoregressive setup that is useful when you want to identify high frequency shock, when you want to identify, for example, some shocks that have high frequency, such as daily, weekly frequency. What is it, the motivation behind this paper? So we know that COVID-19 changed drastically our life in the last year. And uncertainty induced by the COVID-19 is having a great impact on the business cycle. If, for example, we consider a measure of uncertainty, such as the VIX, the implied volatility of the stock market that represent the financial uncertainty, we can see the evolution in the last year. Since this variable is a high frequency variable in the sense that we have our observation at daily level, we can see clearly how is the evolution, in particularly after the declaration of a pandemic status for the COVID-19. And if you look in this table, in this plot, you can see clearly that this variable reached the top exactly after this declaration, March 16. What we can learn from this plot? We can understand that the VIX is a high frequency variable that evolves over time with a lot of variation. And when you want, for example, to understand the impact of this kind of shock on a business cycle that is represented mainly by low frequency indicators, monthly, such as industrial production, or quarterly, such as the GDP, you can have in your mind a question: how can we identify a high frequency uncertainty shock, such as the VIX on the US, for example, macro variables? Or in general, how we can identify a high frequency shock on a low frequency variable? That is the main research question we would like to address in our contribution. So what we do? We assess the propagation mechanism of a VIX uncertainty shock in US economy, considering the last 30 years using data sampled at a different frequency. And for this purpose, we introduce a new high frequency identification approach. This new identification approach is useful in particular to study the temporal deviation bias induced by relying on a standard common low frequency var. For example, let's assume that you want to estimate your var with only quarterly or monthly frequency. And what we do in econometric aspect, we estimate a mixed frequency var following the suggestion given by Gazles in his recent paper published in a Journal of Econometrics, and for this reason that we adopt Bayesian technique, and in detail we use a normal inverse Wishart prior for mixed frequency VR as suggested by Goetz and co-authors in 2016 in a Journal of Econometrics paper. In this paper they applied this kind of prior in a setup of mixed frequency var, but for Granger causality testing. Instead, in our case, the main difference is that we want to consider shock identification strategy. So we want to understand what's going on in terms of a structural analysis. First spoiler of a presentation. So we are able to document how the mixed frequency matters, in the sense that when we implement a common low frequency var, we report some responses in case of an increase of uncertainty shock that are different from the response that we are able to report when we are relying on a mixed frequency var with our high frequency identification approach. And this aspect is quite important because we are able to provide a novel contribution in favor of using mixed frequency approach. So in terms of the structure of my presentation, I'm going to give you a quick review of the current literature and how we contribute to this kind of a literature. After that, I will make an overview of the methodology and the machinery that we are going to use in our paper. And the illustrative example is going to explain the main details. And after that, I'm going to conclude the presentation with some policy suggestion. So in terms of the current literature, our paper is going to contribute the growing literature about the application of Bayesian technique in a mixed frequency VR environment. In this kind of approach, we have two different strands of literature. So we can mention a couple of papers by Sherfide and Song, 2015-2020, where they implement a Bayesian mixed frequency var in a state space representation. On the other side, we can mention the shrinkage prime and stacked mixed frequency var, that where we are going to contribute, because our approach is going to end up in this kind of a strand of a literature. However, there are several contributions. For example, McCracken encoders, Berger encoders, Coop encoders, and Cimadon encoders. But all these contributions are providing important empirical evidence for nowcasting purposes. Only Cimadon encoders is going to give also a structural analysis contribution. Instead, in our paper, we just give and provide an evidence in terms of shock identification. So we end up in this second category of this strand of literature. However, our paper is also able to contribute the current literature about the use of mixed frequency var for identify uncertainty shock, because in our illustrative example, we are going to consider what's going on when we have an increase of financial uncertainty, as we document at the start of presentation. And there are important contributions in this aspect. Casarin co-authors is going to document an interesting empirical evidence relying on a Bayesian approach with Markov switching model. On the other side, Ferrara, Guerin, and Bakiokin co-authors are going to contribute to this trend of literature, providing the estimation of mixed frequency var models using frequentist approach. Alternative approaches to our investigation are also documented by Chudik and Georgiadis and Alessandro and co-authors. Alessandro and co-authors provide an interesting approach where they are going to use a different way to identify an high frequency shock. Instead of using a mixed frequency approach, they rely on a two-step proxy SVAR, where in the first step they consider the high frequency shock that is aggregate in the second step. On the other side, Chuding and Georgiadis are going to contribute this literature, providing several illustrative examples where they investigate about the role of temporal aggregation bias and the mixed frequency VAR, proposing a novel frequentist approach. Last but not least, our paper is also able to contribute to the growing, huge current literature about the study of a macroeconomic effect of a COVID-19 induced financial uncertainty. We can mention a lot of papers in this kind of strand of the literature. However, almost all papers are able to agree on an important aspect, that an increase in financial uncertainty is followed by a contraction in real activity. And this one is a second spoiler in this introduction of presentation, is what we are going to find in our empirical exercise. So we are able to find an important result that is exactly the same in the literature, where instead of using mixed frequency, they use a common low frequency Var. However, we are able to find the same result using a different approach. So let's move to the study of the mixed frequency Var machinery. So as anticipated before, here we are going to consider a stacked mixed frequency Var approach. And in detail, we are going to consider a model which is represented by the equation 1. And this equation 1, we have a vector zt that depends on itself and its legs. But what is this vector? Is our stacked component in our model. Stacked in the sense that the first part of this vector is represented by the high frequency variable that is in our exercise represented by the VIX. And in detail, in our illustrative example, we are going to provide the evidence of a VIX at a weekly level, aggregating because the true data generation process of a VIX is at daily level, and also we consider the daily frequency. So we decided to implement these two different exercises because we are going to understand what is the difference in terms of temporal aggregation bias when we have a mismatching between weeks and months, or days and months. And as anticipated, months is a low common frequency that we are going to consider in the common low frequency Var, but also is a low frequency for our business cycle indicator. And this indicator, these variables are represented in our stacked vector by X, and itself is a vector. So here we are going to consider that these variables are represented by the inflation, industrial production, consumption, short-term interest rate. So in terms of how we can define the size of our stacked vector, we need also to consider that the high frequency variable, let's assume that is at a weekly level, is disaggregated in 4 variables. So we have here the VIX in the first week, a VIX in the second week, a VIX in the third week, and the VIX in the first week. And after that, we are going to consider our vector of low frequency Var. So now this is the setup of our stacked mixed frequency Var. So as I anticipated in the introduction, here we are going to follow the suggestion proposed by Geisler to estimate this model adopting a Bayesian technique. And in details, we are going to consider that the prior distribution of a mixed frequency Var coefficient A are just given as reproduced by the formula 2. So we have here this prior distribution that depends on the parameter rho, and we have a rho in case of high frequency and low frequency. And the uncertainty around the prior instead is specified as goets and quarters. And this equation number 3 is going to show you that the variance is depending on also lambda hyperparameter that controls the tightness of the prior, And we have also the ratio between sigma h and sigma L that accounts for different scales of the variable, and we consider our phi parameter that controls the influence of low frequency, high frequency data, and vice versa. So this prior has been suggested by Goetz and co-authors that are adapting the approach proposed by Bambura, Giannone, Reiklin in 2010 when they introduced a large Bayesian VR. They adapted for the granular causality testing in mixed frequency Vars. So they use this normal inverse Wisher prior for mixed frequency using dummy observation. And to understand what's going on, we consider that when we match the moments in the second equation, the third equation, we end up to have this new equation number 4, where we introduce this concept of dummy observation. And here we are going to consider that rho h is set to be equal to 0, while rho L sigma h and sigma L are chosen from univariate regression, and the parameter lambda is selected by maximizing the marginal likelihood, as suggested by Carriere and co-authors. And the intercept as a diffuser prior. So now let's move to the illustrative example where we are going to consider our empirical exercise. And as I anticipated, we are going to estimate our model on US economy data in the last 30 years. So in the baseline exercise, we are going to exclude the COVID-19 period, and we stop by our sample at 2019 at the end of the year. So we are including the low frequency variable that are represented by the consumer price index for inflation, industrial production index, real personal consumption expenditures for consumption, and the effective federal fund rates for the short-term interest rate. So as anticipated before, I'm going to consider the high frequency shock in these two versions at weekly level and daily level. So at the weekly level, we are going to consider a small mismatching between the high frequency and low frequency because we have weeks against months. At the daily level, we are going to increase the mismatching between days and months. And in this case, we are going also to consider that each month has 20 observations as implemented by Goetz and co-authors. So in terms of number of legs, we select 3 according to a Kaike criterion, but in our robustness check, we are going to consider also a different lag length. In terms of identification scheme, in this exercise, we are going to propose the Cholesky decomposition, placing the VIX in the first position, considering the publication lags as documented by Ferrara and Ran. However, in our robustness, we are also placing the VIX in the last position, and we are going to find a same qualitative result. And I can also add that our procedure can be adapted to other identification strategy, for example, cell restriction. We just needed to accommodate the prior in that way. So it's a very, very flexible procedure. Last but not least, in terms of the size of the shock. So in our exercise, in particular in today's presentation, I'm going to show you that if we assume that we have a huge impact of a financial uncertainty, we can have a specific result. This result is not different in qualitative terms when we change the magnitude of our size of a COVID-19 uncertainty shock. And in particular, here in this presentation, I'm going to show you the result in case that the increase of uncertainty shock is given by 5 times of the standard deviation, as suggested by Kajan and co-authors when they consider the COVID-19 uncertainty. And this number 5 is coming from the ratio between the size of the VIX in March 2020 and the size of the VIX in February 2020. So we assume that we have a very huge shock. So now let's consider, let's move to look at our first picture. In this plot, we report the responses, the weekly responses of macro variables to uncertainty shock. Weekly because we report different response in each column. So we have week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. And we report the response for inflation, industrial production, consumption, and short-term interest rate. So here we report with the continuous red line, the median response, and we have a red shading at 68%, at 90% for the gray shading of the credibility interval. And at the first glance, we can recognize that when we have an increase of uncertainty, we have detrimental effect for all the business cycle variable, because we have a reduction of inflation, of industrial production, of the consumption, and the short-term interest rate. And this result is statistically significant. What is interesting is that we have a bigger impact of this increase of uncertainty in the first week. And we have a reduction of this impact in the next weeks. This result is also documented by Ferrara-Guerin, where they use a different econometric approach because they use a frequentist mixed frequency var, but they identify a similar shock, a similar high frequency shock with very similar macro variable. And we can see that we have a huge impact of this result in the first week of our months, and this result see that if there is a shock in the first week, the impact is bigger than in the last week, and is also an important result when you want to identify this shock on macro variable. So let's consider what's going on when we aggregate the weekly responses. So the red line is the average of a previous result in the in 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, and the blue line represents the cumulative frequency var. So what we can learn from this plot? First, we can understand that if we have an increase of uncertainty, we have detrimental effect also when we estimate a cumulative frequency var. And the result is different, not only in the short run, but also in the long run. And this result is statistically significant for several months. So we can understand that there is such a difference of the result when we are using a cumulative frequency var, and we can document what is called the temporal aggregation bias, in the sense that we can see that there is this difference, and is important because if you are relying on cumulative frequency var, you document a bigger detrimental effect. So we try to understand if this result is depending on the prior that we consider in our exercise. So in our exercise, we assume that rho h is equal 0. So we change the rho and we note that these aggregate weekly response are exactly the same. So we don't have any impact of the prior in our exercise. So let's move what's going on when we do the same exercise, what we are including a daily VIX. So in this case, we can see using this three-dimensional plot that we have a lot of time variation, in the sense that we can see that there is the same behavior that was documented in case of weekly VIX, that the response is different over time. And this result is quite interesting, but to interpret and to understand if we have a temporal aggregation bias, we can do exactly what we have done before, in the sense that we aggregate our response at a monthly level, and we compare this response to the one of a cumulative frequency var. So the blue lines are exactly the same of 2 plots ago, and the red line is the aggregated value of this plot. So what we can learn is that the temporal aggregation bias is bigger. So we have a such bigger impact using a cumulative frequency var when our high frequency variable is expressed at daily level. So we made several robustness. So we changed the number of legs. So we include, for example, more variables, and we consider unemployment rate and a 10-year treasury bill. And we document that we have exactly the same result in qualitative terms, and the sign of the response for these additional macro variable are what we can expect in an empirical exercise of identification of uncertainty shock. So we substitute the monetary tools with a shadow rate a la Vuxian, and the result is not changing. When we order the VIX in the last position in our VR, again, nothing changed in our procedure. So we get exactly the same qualitative response. And when we exclude the global financial crisis, so we stopped our estimation at 2007, we are going to get exactly the same result, with exception of a consumption where we document a strange result, in the sense that we don't have a statistically significant response, but this result is dependent on the fact that the global financial crisis was very important for the consumption, and when we exclude this period, we should use a different specification, a different set of macro variables in our analysis. And last but not least, when we are going to include the COVID-19 period, so we are going to add 11 observations in our investigation. We are going to see first here with the VIX at weekly level that the result is qualitatively the same, and we are documented a bigger detrimental effect for the macro variable than before. And again, if you are relying on a cumulative frequency var, you are making a temporal aggregation bias, because if you are using a mixed frequency var with our identification approach, you get a more precise result, in the sense that also we get less impact. I can also remind you that here we just use a linear setup. We didn't use any stochastic volatility model as suggested by Lenza Primiceri and other different authors, where they document how we can exclude some outliers, or we can use non-linear model. So here we just use a linear model. Result is pretty the same when we are using the VIX at daily level. So let's wrap up. In this paper, we investigate the fact of high frequency shock on low frequency variables relying on mixed frequency data. We introduced a novel Bayesian mixed frequency var model applied to structural analysis that is useful to identify the VIX shock US macro variables as illustrative example. As general main result, we document the detrimental effect of uncertainty on real economic activity in both common and mixed frequency. As a specific result to this illustrative example, we also document a moderate evidence of temporal aggregation bias, more pronounced in case of large mismatching between high frequency and low frequency. And in terms of policy implication, in addition to this important temporal aggregation bias, we are also documented how the timing of a shock matters in the response of low frequency variables. That is already a result shown by Ferrara-Guerin, but we are able to document with our procedure, and we are able to document how this result is very important when there is a huge mismatching between daily frequency for the high frequency shock and the low frequency represented by months frequency. So what next in our research agenda? So we would like to extend our model, including nonlinearities, has also implemented by several contributors, in particular when they are including the current COVID-19 period. And also we can provide other illustrative examples where there is a necessity of identify high frequency shock on a low frequency macro variable. So thanks very much for your attention. So any question, comments are very, very welcome.